and talk a little
Sure.
bit about you personally. So,
One of my favorite topics, man.
great. So, you growing up, you mentioned you grew up on the south side of Chicago. Talk to me about like your upbringing, when you learned about race, when race became like a factor in your life, your experiences with race. How did you develop your thoughts and consciousness about race and where you're at now?
Well, first of all, just in terms of like, you never want a false flag. I was born on the south side of Chicago. I was born in the Bridgeport neighborhood. I had a lot of relatives that live in Chatham, if you're familiar with Chicago. A couple of them that lived in the projects at this time. Diverse family, Black, Irish, Native American. At any rate, I moved pretty early on to Wicker Park, although this was pre-gentrification. So, I mean, people jokingly called it Needle Park, and you had the purple-haired punks skating around. It's a very urban environment. In a little before high school, for academic and athletic reasons, I moved to nearby Aurora, which is Illinois' second largest city, and basically did pretty well academically, decently athletically. Um, Lived there, went to East Aurora High School. So, one of the things, so when you ask about my consciousness about race, I'm not inclined to present any time as a golden age or anything like that. But one thing that was very notable about these environments was that they were all extremely integrated. Now, that's not necessarily the norm for Chicago, but Bridgeport has a mix of, Blacks, Italians, Irishmen, Mexican Americans. It's now primarily a Mexican American neighborhood. I moved to Wicker Park, which has, unbearable hipsters from everywhere in the world. And then I moved to the east side of Aurora, which is the traditionally working class side of the city, about 150,000 people, Eastern Europeans, Mexicans, Blacks. I won't say everyone got along because there was constant fighting. When I was in high school, or in middle school, actually, 1 year in middle school, people played a violent version of tag called Move Out, and they broke into simi gangs. So there was the Locos, which was Hispanic kids, and the Loonies, which was black and white kids. And the point of the game is that if people caught you doing various things, they could kick your ass. So this went on. But people also had an incredibly diverse range of friends. Interracial dating in all these situations was pretty much the norm. Although, as I recall, all my girlfriends but one in high school were Black. But at any rate, I lived in this situation. Race was there, but in an almost entirely working class environment, it wasn't there in the way that it is in academia, in my experience.
Of course
People
not. I
didn't.
just want to hear about your experience. So, like, did you identify as a certain race?
Oh yeah, identified as Black. I mean, but it was sort of like, again, so when I say race, working class race consciousness is a little different. I had a good friend named Marcus Jackson when I was in high school. I don't think we were ever on a varsity team at the same time together. We did things like play park league basketball together. And we were nicknamed Sunshine and Midnight because I'm very light skinned. He was very dark skinned. So, like, when one of us would leave the court and the other guy would go in, people would say things like, "Hey, the sun is rising." And it was, race existed in this sense. And these were mostly Black players, competitors. So race existed in the sense that everyone was very aware of the ethnic background of other people. Ethnicity, if you talk about how Bosnian kids were viewed or something, might be a better term for this than race. But people most of the time didn't care very much. And this would be true in a very earthy way. People would talk about white girls having pink nipples, or would discuss whether Hispanic kids were fast runners by nature. For the middle distances, Blacks were stereotyped as faster in short distances, so on down the line. And then you'd go on and go to class or to the bodega. So that was my racial experience. And this, by the way, I've found is a pretty typical working class racial experience. Like, if you're a white kid, you might have to fight if you go to a mostly Black school, but you have a Black girlfriend. It's not incredibly pervasive in your mind every moment of every day that you have, say, white privilege. In fact, it's debatable whether you do if you're living in Detroit. When I got to college, in fact, I'm kind of glad about this. I had an interesting life. Um,
Obviously.
no, but like, I
You've
grew
had
up
a
in,
unique life.
yeah, I grew, and I actually think that shaped my thinking.
I think so too.
No, but I mean, like, so I grew up basically in the hood, like working class hood, not like Cabrini Green, 20-story tall buildings. I actually go there once. I went there a couple of times, but I went there once. I think I was watching friends play basketball, and I remember people started throwing batteries out of the top windows, and I was like, "Wow, now this is tough." We just waited till they cleaned everything up, and the guys finished playing, and we went back to our nicer slum neighborhood. But anyway, I grew up in working class, fairly tough area. After school, I traveled a little bit. I went with American Field Service or one of those junior varsity Peace Corps type groups to Costa Rica was the primary country. Came back a bit later and went to college. So I went to Southern Illinois University. And again, I went to mostly these sort of Illinois directional schools. Southern Illinois was, again, very integrated. It was known for, there were some racial tensions, but also known for white and black kids partying together. It was known for being a school full of drunks. Like our academic ranking was actually affected by that some years. We'd be like number 12 in the Playboy party schools listing and number 290 academically. But I did pretty well there and I applied to law school. And I think that's really when I started to understand the perspectives of the American upper middle class a little more. I got into the University of Illinois College of Law, which at the time was 16th in the country or something like that. And it was a dramatic change. Like I took my hoodie and, skateboard. I was like 21 when I graduated from college and went into this very professional environment and noticed that everyone seemed to be hypersensitive about problems much more minor than those any of my friends had. This doesn't mean that something like family divorce or indeed racism wouldn't be a problem in these people's lives. But there seemed to be a constant focus on, even more than race, say feminism for Caucasian females that I dated. Issues of sort of backstabbing and conflict within the law school and race itself. I mean, I recall at that time we had something like 3 or 4 Black student groups within this institution. We only had perhaps 400 students. So that was when I became aware of the fact a lot of people are hypersensitive about these things that I've always just sort of taken for granted. Could be good, could be bad. After analyzing it, I feel it's mostly bad, to be quite frank. But that was my first exposure to, postmodernism, really, or to contemporary racial theory. And again, I'm a pretty smart guy. I did well enough in law school. I'm sure a lot of people I went to law school thought I was a complete asshole. Like I drank a lot and didn't pay much attention. And, I didn't really understand the ritualized routines you were supposed to engage in. In law schools, as of course, there's only one test and it's given at the end of the year. And I mean, it's based on how well you've briefed your cases throughout the year. So I did a good job the first month of each semester, briefing my cases, got my work done. And then I kind of did whatever I wanted. Like I kept my hoops game up, drank beer, like hung out. And I found out later this was considered very offensive. Like you're supposed to be wildly focused, just every day in there, backstabbing, wearing your blazer and so on. I graduated in decent form actually, and was considering what to do after law school. And again, I haven't failed at anything during this period. Like I'd helped my friend and former track coach Ruben Zamora run for Congress. We thought there should be a Hispanic representative for East Aurora and so on down the line. So again, there's kind of a neutral perspective on race, but it was relevant that most of our elected officials were of this other variety. The guy we ran against actually was Dennis Hastert, who was the Speaker of the House at the time. So we lost, although by less than everyone expected. And this was about a year before he was found to have been involved in some interesting sexual scandals. It was a weird time. Anyway, so I got out of law school, went and got a PhD. I can keep going on if you want, because I did a lot of stuff while I got a PhD. I had to go back to Chicago because my mom got sick. That's my background.
Let's pause real quick because you may be the first person who has answered that question without actually telling a story about an incident of racial animus that you experienced. So you really didn't experience anything, huh?
Well, no, I would quite the opposite. Like this I think is pretty important. When you say an incident of racial animus, like one of the things I described was that there was a partly racially based fist fighting game at the school I went to. Like,
yeah, but I mean, like it wasn't like, it sounded more like it wasn't, even though the groups were racially divided, it wasn't like, oh, we're going to get the Hispanic kids, like it doesn't sound like that's what it was.
We liked them guys fine. They had to be in shape for the game. I mean, no, it was basically, I think that I have, I think this is important though. I think that I have experienced a great number of incidents that would probably strike a person of the professional managerial class who is focused on race as shockingly racist. And just across the board from blacks and whites, I suppose. Like one of the girls I dated in high school, we actually discussed like the skin color of a potential kid with her mom. This person was black. And they said they wanted their kid to be at least mocha. And they had this long conversation with me about whether I was black enough. And it was just like, okay, I mean, mom's kind of a crazy bigot, but it's what it is. Weird flex, but okay. I've been called, I suppose, the N word and things like fights. It's yeah, I've definitely experienced racial animus. I think that this is an interesting point from a psychological standpoint. I've experienced a fair amount of racial conflict in life. However, I've experienced it as dramatically secondary to things like social class, gang, although I didn't gangbang myself, and personal friend group conflict. So of all the things that struck me as posing dangers living in East Aurora or traveling to the Jets in Chicago or something like that, race was not in the top 5. So I was aware of race in the sense of I prefer black girls to blondes. I don't know if I still have the same perspective now, but I mean, it's something I thought in high school. But I didn't see race in the sense of like those guys are the enemy, really, because it would have been hard to do that. Like if you worked on a crew during the summer or something like that, there'd be a mix of black and white and Spanish guys. So I saw it. I experienced racial conflict. It wasn't until I got into another world that I noticed how much time people spent thinking about this. Now, some of that, of course, is because of real social conflicts that had existed before I came on the scene. And it's often easy for kids that come from a heartland or a working class environment and become successful to see that, as opposed to just saying, work harder, bro, kind of that sort of attitude. But the reality also just was that people seem to be exaggerating smaller versions of the things I'd already encountered. So I guess my development of racial consciousness came from living in highly integrated areas where class was much more relevant. Like if I were to go back to my old neighborhood and just my average ass 10-year-old Mercedes right now, people would be like, damn, Reilly, a millionaire.
Got you. Okay, I think that clears it up. Very good. All right. Yeah, the one thing I noticed there is that you didn't sounds like you kind of just were doing your own thing in school and weren't really bothered by the things going on around you. For me personally, I definitely had a lot of issues where race came into play, where it affected my ability to get opportunities academically and professionally. So I'm glad that you haven't had to experience that, but a lot of people have. So I think it's not only that people come from a certain vantage point, but also, your upbringing is rare for a black person to grow up in such an integrated environment continuously, and is not normal for most black people. So I think that probably has a lot to do with how your thoughts developed about race, because you're not in the typical environment as a lot of other black Americans.
Maybe so. I would just do a couple of very quick notes there. So I think everyone who's a member of a minority group has had race work against them in terms of hiring or something like that. I think there have been jobs I've been rejected for because of race, or because of, again, when you get into this big city environment, because of ethnicity or tribe. I mean, if you're applying for a summer construction job at a firm called Hernandez Rodriguez y Garcia, it's not going to be an advantage to be black or white. If after law school you're applying,
that's definitely not necessarily true, brother. But okay.
I mean, no, it's.
I know why you said it, but
it's obviously that you're not generally going to have a huge edge as the same social class guy who's not Latino and doesn't speak Spanish.
It all depends on who Rodriguez and Gutierrez and the rest of them are.
Of course, everything depends on who people are, which is why we can endure in society despite our silly fault lines like race and class. But in general, it's not a great sign. Of course, you still apply for the job, and most people aren't bigots in that group or any other. But at any rate, so I definitely have had race work against me, sometimes in complex ways. But one thing I will say, it's absolutely critically important to be honest and acknowledge the other side of this. Like when I applied to law school, I was a Clio fellow.
So was I.
Many black students, yeah, it's a great program. I've given to Clio. So again, I'm pro-black in the sense I want to see black people succeed. But many black students at top tier law schools receive top flight fellowships designed to get more black people, especially men, into law school. So when I applied to law school, not only did I probably benefit from affirmative action in the applications process, although I myself was quite a solid candidate, I also, upon getting in, was told that I'd received this fellowship that would pay me, I believe it was $24,000 a year, to attend the school. It would help me with tutoring and so on down the line. It's a Council for Legal Educational Opportunity. Great group for those listening, who I suspect would be inclined to support and give. But again, when I went to graduate school, I was recruited for graduate school specifically in part because I was a Black man. I was at U of I Law, and I was trying to decide what to do. Because again, I was young for much of my life. I just am now through the phase where I was like the young homie, X, because I was promoted early on in school, so on down the line. Anyway, when I got out of law school, I was like 23, maybe. And what I trained for was, to the extent you train for anything, white collar criminal prosecution. I don't think my classmates necessarily knew how serious I was about this, but I kind of wanted to lock up these Enron assholes, as opposed to, a kid with a baggie of weed on the corner. I'd taken criminal law, criminal pro, crim pro 2, so on down the line. But you're applying for very, very serious jobs, and you can imagine that field. And I'm, again, 22, 23. So I was contacted by Southern Illinois University out of the blue. And one of the reasons that they had gotten in touch with me, of course, I'd then sent an application and so on, perfectly formal process. But one of the reasons they'd gotten in touch with me was that they wanted more minority males on the faculty in Illinois. And when I got down there, again, I had a full fellowship. It was the DFI, Diversifying the Faculty of Illinois Fellowship, another great program, DFI, people should consider supporting. But to the extent that I've been denied jobs because I was African American, I think that's happened 2 or 3 times, or not Hispanic, that's certainly once or twice. I think that I would take that trade in exchange for, we're going to give you $30,000 a year to go to a tier 1 law school. So I've experienced the positives and the negatives of having a particular racial status. But again, I think being Black or being interracial or light-skinned, or however you want to put that, is one of my top 10 identities. I've done a standard identities chart. Actually, I did it when I think Rod Graham suggested it online, believe it or not. But I mean, it's not in the top 5. It was something that impacted my life, but what really significantly impacted my life was social class changing. Going from the hood, sitting on a skateboard, drinking beer, to upper class. That was to the extent I am, I'm going to have a decent amount of money. I'm going to buy a house in Kentucky on a hill. So I think that changed my life more than racial stuff did, but certainly I faced discrimination. It's bad,
I want to talk a little bit about what you just said. So it sounds like you wanted to kind of reveal this false narrative that was that you saw a pattern through the media through the years, through these incidents. So was that just a curiosity of yours, or were you hoping to reveal something to your audience?
Well, I think that I'm not. So I guess this is something I said in a conversation earlier today. I'm not occasionally heterodox, and I don't lean entirely right or left, although I obviously lean more right. But I mean, I think that the majority of things the average middle-class citizen believes to a large extent are probably not true. About, for example, the goodness of elected officials, about the results of obeying the rules, about the things that you are told are dangerous to you. I had a good conversation with Thaddeus Russell about this, actually, on the Unregistered podcast. But I mean, so this was one of these examples. I think, how to say this without sinking into bullshit myself? I think that the media has 2 problems, one of which you may agree with, one of which you probably will agree with, one of which you may disagree on. One is extreme sensationalism. So the media in the USA is essentially a product placement vehicle. The goal of MSNBC or Fox is to sell big trucks and penis pills. The content is incidental to doing this. So what's put out there is what you might refer to as a clickbait drag. It's the sort of stories that will bring in the most eyeballs and thus sell the most product. So there's a tendency towards sensationalist, quick building narratives. There's also the reality that the US national mass media is only about 7% conservative. That includes libertarian, that includes center right. The other 93% is leftist, mainstream liberal, or left-leaning moderate. This is Pew 2004, every smaller scale replication since. Someone might correct me in the comments, but it's found pretty much the same thing. So the stories that are featured outside of Fox and OAN tend to be on one side of the aisle, police genocide against Blacks as versus, say, illegal immigrants shooting citizens or something like that. But the point of hate crime hoax, and more broadly, the point of taboo, was that a large number of the media narratives that we see aren't real, for want of a better descriptor there. In terms of high profile racial conflict incidents, it absolutely is true, although we can go through exact percentages, that a very large number of these turn out to either be complete fakes or to be what you could call narrative collapses, where the story might be two idiots fighting, but it's nothing like what was originally presented. And if you go through most recent stories of this kind, I mean, Erica Thomas, the congresswoman that said she was verbally, if not physically assaulted in an upper end grocery store. Covington Catholic, Jussie Smollett, the Nikki Jolly house fire, Grand Rapids, beautiful young black girl said she was actually urinated on. Air Force Academy, that claims that there was such intense racial conflict between cadets that a general went down there and gave a famous speech. It turned out all the incidents in question were falsified by a disaffected black cadet. So on the one hand, many of these stories, people fighting in dog parks and so on, don't turn out in the end to be what they were initially presented as being. I think that's fair to say. But more broadly, I mean, I note in the start of the book that there are only about 7,000 hate crimes reported in a typical year. That's 7,000 too many. But again, there's not a great epidemic of at least violent racial conflict in the United States. To the extent that people believe this, it's almost wholly a creation of media on left and, yes, in fact, right. Again, violent interracial crime is 3% of serious crime. So I did want to make all of these points in the book. So the overarching theme of my first two books, my fourth book will be almost historical. But of the two major books, the overarching through line is a lot of the things that you're hearing simply aren't true. To close, just one example about beliefs on the frequency of interracial crime or crime in general, danger in society. The SRC, the Skeptic Research Center, well-known, kind of heterodox, centrist, not really a political position think tank, recently asked a very large group of people how many unarmed brothers, black men, they believe are killed by cops in a typical year. Did you read this, by the way? Did you see this study?
I did.
Okay. Did it surprise you at all?
No.
Yeah, it didn't. It kind of surprised me in terms of the extent. I think what it did for me more than anything else was show media effects. So, I mean, there's no need to bore you with the whole thing then. But
I mean, don't you think it just shows that people are ignorant?
No.
Well, I mean, well, hang on, though. It does, right? Because, like, that's what you're saying. You're saying that people don't know the truth. That means they're ignorant, right? So, like, you're.
It means they're misinformed.
Okay, you could be misinformed and ignorant, brother.
I'm gonna argue there's a difference there. I'm gonna
what
argue
is it?
an ignorant person simply has an absence of information. A misinformed person has a presence of false information. This might seem like a distinction without a difference, but it's not.
To me, yeah.
One of the questions they ask in the study is, how much media do you consume? And what you find is that very liberal people who consume a lot of media believe that, between 1,000 and 10,000 unarmed brothers are killed every year. It's like 15% said it was about 10,000 and 8% said it was more than that. I think that people are being consciously fed false information by the primary information sources in this country.
Well, no one's being told that 10,000 unarmed black men are being killed.
I'm sorry?
No one's being told that figure, no one's being told those figures.
I'm not sure that's true. I mean, like, I read and reviewed Attorney Crump's book, Open Season, The Legalized Genocide of Colored People. Like, there are people throwing around terms like genocide.
Yeah, but not because 10,000 unarmed black people are being killed. That's not the reason.
Doesn't he say it's thousands at one point?
I've never heard him say that, but like, maybe, I don't know. Have you heard that?
Okay, I don't want to misquote him. Like, I want to be scrupulously honest through this.
I want to. If he said that, I would like to know, actually.
But like, okay, how about Chernobyl? Like, this is one went on Fox News primetime and said at least every day an unarmed black man is murdered. This is a famous interview with one of the I don't know. Again, one of the leading figures in early BLM. And you're talking, when you say that, like Black Lives Matter Global Foundation, it has a meaning. It's not every guy to protest. But I mean, that's a quote. So like, let's say an estimate that's frequently repeated is from 1 a day up to like 1,000. And people don't pay a great deal of attention to the detail in stories. And I think it's even more than that. By the way, again, just being honest, so 15% said it was about 10,000. Another like 40% in the left wing category said it was about 1,000. So there are a lot of people that are right around the figure that you do see in the media. And I guess that's my only point. Like, I don't think those people are ignorant. I think those people have consumed multiple stories about violence against black men that implies that this is the real figure.
It's that last part. It's the implication part, right? Like, you can't imply that a certain number of people are dying. Like you either have to you either have to say it or you don't say it, right? Like I think anyone who's watching that and making an implication that they have to take responsibility for whatever leaps they're making in their mind. I don't think you can really blame the media reporting on these incidents for that. Despite
I think that there are two comments that I would make there. First of all, again, I mean, we've given a couple quotes where people did essentially say that. Without having more quotes available, I wouldn't like make them up, but people have certainly said that in very public forums that people will remember. But also, too, I think that there's the question of what you choose to cover. So in the United States in a typical year, we're a violent country. There are, say, 20,000 murders in a bad year. That's what we had last year. Now, that was a jump. We haven't seen that since the late 1990s, but that's not an unprecedented year, right? So there are 20,000 killings in a typical year. Black people, by the way, make up less than half of them in many years. I mean, we're still overrepresented, but there are plenty of white and Hispanic criminals. A lot of people get shot in America. We can discuss why. That's an actual topic of conversation. But if you devote, say, half of your, I think this is correct. If you devote half of your murder coverage to unarmed black men being shot by police, and I think you could easily do an analysis and find this first 100 pages of Google or whatnot, people might realistically assume that that is half of the people killed by violence in the country. And this is why,
I don't know why that's realistic.
Because you're seeing the media cover a topic, violence.
That doesn't make it realistic to me. That's my point. It's like, just because you're seeing that, why would you then assume? Again, that's an assumption that like makes no sense. It's not logical.
But it absolutely follows logically. Now, I'm not saying I would do that. It absolutely follows logically.
How? How? You're gonna have to draw a direct line for me.
Coverage is of the unarmed brothers that are killed. So you think it's 10,000, and the number they gave was 10,000. I mean, to me, like I think
that
we can go back and forth on this for a while. I don't
weak thinking.
What's up?
That is some very weak and lazy thinking.
Well, no, not for me. I mean, like, I'm not the person that thinks this.
I know but I'm just saying in general, I think anyone who's doing that is making a huge error in thought. But I understand what you mean.
But no, it's so like, if you don't mind for a minute, I would move away from something less controversial or from something of this kind that invokes race and invokes class. I think that people have a lot of these beliefs, and whether or not you're right that this is lazy thinking, many people, like Barry Glasser in 1999 wrote The Culture of Fear. And this more than anything else, and people might be surprised to hear this, like this hippie sociologist influenced some of my books, so on. But more than anything else, this was the guideline for taboo to some extent, where this guy said, I'm going to look at all of these things people are afraid of, from crack babies to plane crashes, to the big one that made him famous was young child kidnapping, which I specifically talk about for like 5 pages in Taboo. And I'm going to see how common they are. And he found things very, very similar to what SRC found. Again, my numbers from this 1999 book might be slightly off, but the average upper middle class mom thought that thousands of kids were kidnapped every year. They kept using the phrase taken by strangers. And this is the period when you saw like kids walking around in leashes. Like this is like the early OOs in cities. I noticed this mostly with younger Caucasian women, but I've been told it occurred among, many a group. But Glassner points out the total number of kids that are actually kidnapped in a typical year is like 100. Kidnapped means a specific thing. It means taken for more than a week by a non-family member, presumably abused, horrible stuff. But he kind of asked the question, why is that surprising? How easy would it be for a typical adult white or black male to just go into an American working class neighborhood and walk out with a screaming kid? Could you do that? Where would you do it from? And he goes through all these questions and he gives the actual figure. And again, I'm not mocking the moms that believe the higher figure. Every day, if you turned on what would it have been at the time, TNT or early Fox, non-news Fox, I mean, you would have seen one of these stories, Amber's situation or whatever. We have laws named after this stuff. So I think you can only fault people to a certain extent. Like if half the news coverage is about missing blonde kids, you might assume there's an epidemic of missing blonde kids. That's all I got.
I mean, I get how I understand everything you're saying. I understand that someone might make an assumption, but that's still what it is. That's the nature of what they're doing, is they're making an assumption. And I try not personally. I try not to do that. I try to investigate any claims and find out the truth. I'll give you an example since we're bringing up statistics a lot. So
Okay.
when I first started the show, there was a lot of talk about criminal justice statistics and crime statistics. And I wanted to kind of investigate those statistics and the sources that people were drawing on myself. And what I found was that, first of all, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, where most people go to get their stuff, it doesn't even represent even half of the law enforcement agencies in the country. And all of the information that is submitted to them is voluntarily submitted by the departments. That's
That's
how
the
they.
UCR, I think.
I'm sorry?
I think that's the UCR. That's why I don't use it, actually. The BJS is the big anonymous survey, right?
It's all voluntary. It's all, number one, it's all voluntary. Okay, so like number two, it doesn't include even half of law enforcement agencies, a third about.
Yeah, no, I know. But like, can I make one note there?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think we're disagreeing about sources. So like I agree with you. So there are two major sources of criminal justice information. One is the UCR. I believe that's a Uniform Crime Reporting Protocols. That is the departments that voluntarily send crime stats to the FBI. The problem with this, and this is where you get a lot of, and I doubt this will be my main focus tonight, but this is where you get a lot of bullshit alt-right claims about crime. Like 50% of criminals are Black men, for example. What you find is that the districts that report into the UCR are larger than average, mostly urban districts, as you'd expect, so on down the line. What I use for crime statistics is the BJS, but it's the BJS like.
The BJS, you're talking about the one that has the how many people are related, are in the criminal justice system in general, right?
No, the BJS in CVS, the Bureau of Justice Statistics National Crime Victimization Report, at least since they upgraded the methods a couple of years back, is a massive anonymized survey of something like 300,000 people, the same race interviewers. They ask about experiences with crime. Like there are going to be flaws with anything of this kind, but I actually think it's really well done. Like, and that's where you get the actual criminal stats that I use in the country. So they're actually,
how
they're
are they actually collecting the stats?
Well, your contact, so they're two different, well, they're multiple different crime reporting services. But the FBI UCR is criminal justice agencies like police departments reporting to the federales what the crimes were in their area. So you have all the murders in St. Louis or something like that. I find that more useful at a citywide level. I don't think that they're, planting bodies in St. Louis or something like that. The BJS is an anonymized, the response rate is something like 95% contact survey of Americans. So a non-police government agency reaches out to people and says, like, we want to solve the crime problem. We're gathering crime data. This is hypothetical. I didn't write the intro or whatever. But they gather summaries from about 200,000 to 300,000 people of their experiences with crime. So that's why the BJS doesn't include murder. You can't call someone and ask if they're dead. But the BJS is a pretty good source of information. Rate might be questionable. But when you talk about burglary, things like this, you can pretty easily compare the data that they gather to reported rates by, for example, type of police department in the UCR, confirm rough accuracy there and see what the national crime rate is.
That's real rough, man. That is super rough.
I mean, it's easy to criticize, but like the critiquing the BJS would be critiquing almost every survey.
Well, that's what anyone. Well, let me continue my story because in my investigation, right, I did study the people who are trying to create a national database, the group who's doing that, and also every report by the federal government about these databases, and what they in every single one, they mention the inadequacy of the methodology that's being used, and that's why a national database is being created. Of course, there's heavy pushback by guess who, but this is when I figured out that a national database was being created. I spoke to a gentleman who was a police officer in Arizona who then left the force after several years and became a police killing statistician, basically a PhD studying police killing statistics. And he ended up working on the national database right now. So he came on the show and just in his time, and he said he wasn't even remotely close to done, he was mentioning that the number of police homicides that have been recorded in the last decade are undercounted by at least 100%. And so
that again. Sorry, go on. I want to hear the rest.
well, the rest is there's a lot of things that combined with the fact that we see that police lie in their reports all the time with incredible frequency. And those reports are where a lot of the information that these statistics are created come from. It comes from those reports. So I think that just the combination of those two facts make me really reticent to rely on any of these statistics to make any broad sweeping claims about groups.
Okay, so I think I now know why there was some confusion early on. I think we're talking about kind of parallel things. So the FBI, UCR, and the BJS are non-police, just overall crime data for the country. I mean, they probably should include police data, but they don't. The police reporting data, I actually know exactly what you're talking about. You're talking now about the police reporting their number of homicides to the feds, right?
Right.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, not just homicides, but in their reporting in general.
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, like, there are a number of ways as a competent statistician, and I think I'm pretty good. There are better people, there are many worse people, but there are a number of ways to get around this. I mean, you can simply check and see what the correlation between the BJS and the UCR is, given the extreme unlikelihood of numbers that size just spontaneously matching up. Even if you're just using the UCR, we're not talking about the police homicide data now, we're just talking about crime data. I agree that's a flawed data set, but you'd have to show me why half the country would behave dramatically differently from the other half of the country in terms of patterns like males or young people being more likely to commit crime. I do think that one thing the UCR does is undercount white criminals, which we can get into if you want to. But in general, I don't find it a poor database. But your point about police shootings being undercounted by 100%, that's in another government database. So there's also a government database of police shootings, which is like what I think you're talking about throughout, maintained by the FBI. But that's garbage. Nobody uses it. And they do their best.
I'm just talking about, like,
the Washington Post, the counted, is pretty much on point when it comes to police shootings.
Right, and that's what I'm telling you, he was saying the opposite of that. So, like, I mean, I'm just telling you what he said. I'm just reporting right now. Like, you could believe it or not believe it, but he's the one doing the research. So, like, he was saying that in doing his research, and he had to painstakingly follow up with all these cases in all kinds of different ways in order to find out what was actually going on. And he found out that a lot of things had happened, including sometimes when people's guns are fired and sometimes when people get hit, sometimes it's not recorded.
Well, yeah, I mean, so there are two different things here. So first of all, I would agree with this guy if this is one of the points he's making, that the official government database of police shootings, by the way, a major paper came out about this like a year back. And they said that the FBI, and this is why I think there might be some confusion about statistical sources. Like, the whole point of this paper was the FBI undercounts police shootings by like 97%.
I know what paper you're talking about.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, but I agree with that. But the problem is that the WAPO figure is like 98% higher than the governmental figure. So, of course, we can play these statistical games. My guess would be that if someone is a former cop and they're really focused on this field, and they're kind of on the left side of the fence, but they're an honorable guy, they're not counting police shootings, they're counting police homicides. So the Washington Post says very explicitly, we only track police shootings, like fatal police shootings. But the thing is, there are also other sources, like this guy might be involved with mapping police violence, for example. Mapping police violence does have almost twice the number of killings that the WAPO does, but there's a reason for that. Like, one source is shootings and one source is killings. So I actually recognize that unless you trust the guy doing the work, which of course everyone should with me just explicitly, but I mean, unless you totally trust the guy who's cracking the numbers, you can say, well, what database are you using, so on. But there often is a logical through line in this stuff that most social scientists are pretty good with. Like, so if I'm using the WAPO, I would always say unarmed police shootings. That's very different from armed and unarmed police homicides. So, like, the guy, I mean, let's be real explicit about this. The guy
I mean, he mentioned exactly what you're saying. So you guys are in line, okay? Like, we're talking about the same thing. But my point is, right, if that's the case, right, I mean, people like, or groups like Black Lives Matter, people who are trying to talk about police brutality, they're not just talking about shootings, right? They're talking about all of these incidents as well. And so, like, I just think that, not that it's such a greater percentage, if we added on, the extra, but like,
Right.
my point is, like, there are more than people probably think based on the statistics that are widely available. That's all.
Oh yeah, no, excellent point. I mean, and again, I don't know if you expect me to like put on a hood and start screaming that's not true or something. And obviously I'm kidding. I don't think you would have had me on the show in that case. But just no, that's sure.
One of the greatest fear overestimators is critical race theory, from my perspective, recently. It's caused such a panic that all this legislation so quickly was put out in all these
Yeah.
localities. So I want to hear your thoughts about that, because that seems to be an exemplar of what you're talking about as well.
Okay. Yeah, I'll again like just up front. I generally support bills banning things. I'd have to look through all of the anti-CRT legislation before I had a piece by piece opinion on each bill. And I'm probably inclined to be a bit less critical of that than I would be of something equally frenzied on the left. But so obviously you can't pass a law that bans shit like the autobiography of Frederick Douglass.
Well, you
There's
obviously
one
can.
law. Well, I mean, so okay, I absolutely oppose any law that bans legendary black narratives and so on down the line. There's one law. There are two that do come to mind as pretty problematic. One doesn't define critical race theory, so they have something like it's as defined below critical race theory, and I looked at that section and they didn't define it, which is pretty ridiculous. And there's another one that is right on the verge in that the bill says something along the lines of, we prohibit any teaching practice that can cause discomfort to members of any of the following races. It's like whites, blacks. And the question would be what, so again, I'm on the record as opposing both of those. Like, I don't see what could cause discomfort to whites, noting racism, what caused discomfort to blacks, noting crime, or the fact there's still something of a test score gap. Latinos, Mexico is a poorer land than our own, although a beautiful and honorable country. That strikes me as so broad that it could be used to shut down virtually anything.
Well, that's the
With
design.
that, I'm sorry.
That's the
Yeah, I mean,
design. I mean, you're a lawyer. You know that, like, when people write laws, they try to sometimes have these catch-all provisions. Quite a number of
yeah.
them, the bills that are put out, have those kinds of provisions.
Yeah, no, I mean, no, I've also seen laws that ban things that I would fully support banning, like making young children engage in, for example, the practice of privilege walking, like take 4 steps forward if you have a father. That's actually a line in the original privilege
I
walk
mean, why would
draft.
you ban that? What would be the point? For what?
It's a bad and abusive thing to do with kids. I would ban it if
You
I
think
were
it's
king.
abusive?
Yes, of course it's abusive to add, like, for anything to me that involves the stigmatization of individual people, I personally have no objection to banning in the classroom. This might be something where you
The
and I
whole
could,
point is against stigmatization. That's the whole point.
but that's absolutely ridiculous. Like saying to a group of boys at a Catholic school, take 1 step forward if you're not gay, is not something that's going to minimize or eliminate stigmatization. So I guess I'm a fast talker. I can sum up my position here pretty quickly. I oppose very sweeping, broad laws that actually would be designed to ban, say, black cinema. On the other extreme, I don't oppose banning, for example, the teaching of race radicalism in the classroom or certain activities targeted at people. It's actually pretty tough to define. And this gets into, not to jump away from the issue, but kind of my broader thought on this. I'm not sure the CRT label is very useful. So, and this is something that, I mean, like, people I've met and I'm friendly with, like Chris Rufo, would probably disagree on. But if you pass a law banning critical race theory, especially if you don't define fucking critical race theory, all someone's going to do in an integrated urban school is say, well, we're not teaching CRT in this building. We're teaching culturally responsive pedagogy or something like this.
Yeah, but that's why
This,
you
like,
really need to read the legislation, because they go into quite a lot of detail, all of these bills, about what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. And like you said before, it's extremely broad, but anything related to race would fit into one of those categories.
That's not accurate. I mean, I've read actually a couple of these, but like I would almost never debate something I was just totally unprepared to talk about. I've read a number of these bills.
Okay, well, that's why, man. Are you saying that I'm wrong about it?
No, I'm not. You're prepared to debate as well. I think this might just be something we don't agree on, shockingly, But I mean, reading through some of this stuff, like,
I mean, I could pull one up.
No, but I mean, we can both pull them up using Google or one of the sources we just mentioned. But I mean, describing a typical bill, for example, you might see a passage like curricula which focus on teaching of the USA as an institutionally unchangeably racist nation are prohibited, with a couple examples given, like the Zen educational curriculum. I don't really have a problem with that. I have a problem with something. I mean, again, I don't like banning things. It's not the approach I would necessarily take. But I think, in all honesty, the Zen educational curriculum isn't going to make any school better. I don't think the 1619 curriculum is going to make any school better. So if you say in this state, and I think this is really my line here, if you say in this state, we teach a pro-American curriculum, you can pick from the following, but no Zen. Okay. If you say you can't make white people uncomfortable, not cool. Again, another opinion here is that legislation like this has virtually no effect unless it's very specific. So unless you ban specific things like privilege walking or targeted curricula, I don't think the laws are going to do anything. An analogy might be, coming from a legal background, actually, when states attempted to ban Sharia. And people said, well, we don't practice Sharia in this community. We practice, traditional Islam of X variety. And you saw a large number of cases go to the appellate courts and not much ever happened. I wouldn't be surprised to see a similar outcome here.
Me either. I don't think that's the issue. The issue is the impact is that it gives credence to people who are fearful about learning about race and racism, of which there are millions in this country. Well,
this is where I think we might disagree. I mean, go on. I think obviously there's some truth to what you're saying. Like, are there white parents that would prefer their kids learn that the USA was the USA was a savage, howling wilderness when the whites arrived and brought God and Brooks Brothers? Of course, there are white parents that would prefer their children learn this. But I also think it's completely disingenuous to say that opposing an actual critical curriculum, we can drop the race theory language if you want, but Zen, 1619, Sankofa, something like that, is equivalent to not wanting children to learn about slavery. I think there is a very, very small percentage of parents that would not want their children to learn about American slavery. So I don't think those two are the same. I wouldn't send my kids to a school that was teaching one of the classic ethno-Marxist curricula, but I also wouldn't send my kids to a school that didn't teach about slavery or Frederick Douglass.
Yeah, I mean, I guess.
I also don't have kids, so it's easy for me to say all this bold shit or whatever.
Well, I did have someone on the show who is an older white gentleman, okay, highly educated lawyer, who is spending his retirement writing a book about American slavery and the unique brutality of it. And he is doing that because I can't remember exactly what was the moment that he realized that he was undereducated about slavery, but somehow he started learning more about it and investigating more and realizing that he really didn't learn quite a lot of important facts about slavery. And he started asking people he knew, other educated white people, and they were saying the same things, that they never heard this, they never heard that. And, it's also something that I've noticed in my conversations over the decades with people about race, and also in my own education. So, and it's a theme that comes up also in my open racism discussion groups and with people who come on the show. So there's, it seems to be that we haven't been educating people very well about slavery anyway. And so that's kind of Nicole Hannah-Jones's, I think, point partially. And the other part is, how we just kind of create that narrative to a certain extent that you were saying, that kind of America is the best and the white people came and, they only did what, anyone would do. And then...
well, that part's true.
Okay, well, I don't think... I'm not going to... I can't agree with that, but I don't think you could say that's true or false, actually. But I think that, we haven't really centered slavery for sure in the teaching of history.
Well, I think that one point here, and again, I don't really, I should be more faux argumentative here, but I don't disagree with some of that. But I mean, it's also, you have to recognize there are a limited number of days in the week. I mean, when you say,
I'm a teacher, man, so like I've been
but
teaching for 60 years.
You understand at least as well as I do then. But so when you say like we haven't centered slavery, no, I mean, we didn't center a practice that involved 26% of the population of the US South until 1865, probably in most districts. But I mean, I went to school. I went to an inner city school, first of all. I grew up in the hood. My mom was an inner city teacher. So I was born on the south side of Chicago. I grew up on the east side of Aurora. But I mean, we learned extensively about Black American history, Latino history. The East Aurora School District right now is about 80% Latino. It was about half when I attended. I mean, the wars with the Native American Indians, the great chiefs like Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull. I would say we proportionately learned more about slavery and the civil rights movement than about any other two eras of U.S. history.
Did you learn anything about slave revolts?
Yes. I mean, yes.
And so that's pretty rare. People mostly don't learn about them.
Well, I mean, it was like the classic, Nat Turner with the burner stuff. It wasn't a lengthy discussion. We didn't learn about work stoppages, for example, and the many resistances that enslaved people put up. But I mean, again, when you talk about American history, like our history curriculum, we were in high school for 4 years, and we started in Egypt because, again, it was a heavily ethnic school. So we had about 1 year to focus on America prior to the modern era. And in that period, of course, we didn't discuss every detail of slavery. And by the way, sometimes this came down on, you might say, the left side of the fence. We didn't discuss the fact that almost all Black American slaves were sold by Black African slave traders in highly civilized societies either. But I mean, a great deal of information was conveyed to the students. And whenever I've asked about this via Twitter, SurveyMonkey, so on, I've gotten pretty similar responses. In fact, I've only found one group of people that claim to have never been taught about slavery on a large scale. And those are white radicals that are now pushing to change the educational curriculum. So an interesting coincidence.
Yeah.
One last guy, and actually, I mean, I know why that is. I'm a cynic, but nonetheless, you could also say, are those people that were deprived of this education? Where'd they go to school? I'd be interested. I would assume that most of them probably went to very progressive upper middle income schools and learned as much as I did. But the one point here, there's so we've just discussed education about historical slavery. I think we agree on its importance. My point here, though, is simply that opposing the 1619 curriculum doesn't mean you oppose education about slavery. The 1619.
What does it mean?
I'm sorry?
What does opposing it mean?
It means you think it's a bunch of nonsense. I mean, the 1619 Project has regularly said wildly incorrect things that have gotten it scourged by groups like the World Socialist website that would just be obvious allies. Everything unique about America, or to give her full credit, virtually everything unique grew out of slavery. Nicole Hannah-Jones, 2020. I mean, I'm not even going to get into the cliche little stuff about the Revolutionary War and so on. Racism's in America's DNA. There are plenty of people who would say, no, I don't want my kids to learn that, because that seems in practice like the radical fringe of the debate. That seems like it came from the NY Times opinion page. I mean, I will note, I'm one of the founders of 1776 Unites, and a blatant plug, but I mean, we have a curriculum that deals with slavery. There are at least 15 major Black-led educational curricula. What is a Chloe Valdery, Theory of Enchantment, that range from left, right to center that talk about this. So it's absolutely valid for parents to debate which one they want. It's not valid, just to reemphasize, to ban teaching about slavery. But nobody's doing that.
Yeah, I think banning a curriculum is unacceptable unless there's like a real reason. I don't think the reasons you gave, first of all, are number one, accurate, and number two, even if they were accurate, I don't think it would be reasonable to ban it. But
well, those are direct quotes from 1619. I mean, I'm not making up the stuff they said. Like slavery is the primary cause of the Revolutionary War. I didn't even get to.
Not the quotes, in terms of the accuracy and stuff like that. But. Yeah.